The gold disc glinted at the edge of my flashlight beam. I had been just about to stop going any further, but a strange feeling told me to move onward, just for a few more steps. My luck on this expedition was rather poor, so finding this artifact was a blessing, or rather, as it would turn out, a curse. I am an archaeologist, and I specialize in ancient Olmec and Mayan cultures. With the help of my team, I had just found 2 years earlier a new set of ruins buried deep in Honduras. We had excavated millions of dollars worth of artifacts and figured out large parts of Mayan culture. I had hit to strike it big with a find that would make me famous in the worlds of historians, though. That is what I had hoped to achieve on this one last run of this ruin. The disc was laying on a stone dais behind a sacrificial bowl. I quickly crawled through the crumbling hallway and grabbed it. The metal felt cold to the touch, and I felt some lines etched into it. Before I could take a better look at it, I felt the ground start to shake. I turned around and crawled back through the tunnel, then as fast as I could, back to the surface, statues and stone blocks falling around me. I caught the edge of a particular sharp stone, and a cut, deep gash in my right arm. I ran up into the forest, just as I felt the ground make a final shake and turned to see the entrance to the ruin collapse onto itself. As I stood there, a bit of my blood dripped onto the disc. The wind gusted by, warm and moist. Like a breath, it seemed the forest was sighing in relief. I glanced toward the tents we used as base camp and started to walk towards them. I stepped inside the main tent, just in time to see my best friend John die in front of me. He had also been in the ruin when it started to collapse, but he was much less fortunate than I. A large piece of crumbled masonry had hit his head just above the temple. He made it back to the base, and the final member of our team, Michaela, had done what she could to try to save him, but in the end it was too late. I crumpled to the ground, crying, and placed John's head in my lap. As I did, I noticed a small white light leave John's fingertips and head toward the disc. In my grief-stricken state, I thought it was just seeing a trick of the light. I had known John for 25 years, and since high school. John, Michaela, and I were inseparable. He had been my best man at my wedding, and he had been planning on asking Michaela to marry him when we returned home. All of that was taken away in a moment. I got up, and I tried to help Michaela, but she was too far in her own mind for me to be able to wake her from her stupor. I left her there, as I started to pack away the rest of the tents and the other equipment. There was no question about it, whether we were going to stay any longer or not, as we needed to return John's body to his parents for a proper burial. I got everything packed into the Jeep and picked up Michaela and set her in the passenger seat. She was crying unceasingly, but no sound was coming out anymore, just tears. I wrapped up John's body in the tent and laid it down in the bed of the Jeep. As I climbed to the driver's seat, I noticed Michaela holding the disc and rubbing the front of it as one would a pet. I saw a momentary glint of red in her eyes, and I snatched the disc away. She didn't make a protest, so I put it away and started the 10-hour drive to the nearest city with an airport so we could return home. At John's funeral, I went to see if Michaela was all right, as I hadn't seen her since we returned from Honduras. I went to her house, but she didn't answer the door or her phone. I figured she wanted some time to adjust to life without John. I had lost my best friend, but she had lost something more. Couldn't imagine losing my wife or my 3-year-old daughter, let alone in such a tragic way. Later that night, I found the disc in one of my bags. It was about a foot in diameter and about a half an inch thick. It was made from solid gold as well, judging by the weight. In the front, there was a carving of an ancient ritual. 2 men were kneeling on the ground, holding what looked like eggs in their outstretched hands. They offered the eggs to a man sitting on a throne underneath a large sun. I found the disc quite unnerving, especially because it seemed to be giving off a faint glow. I brushed this off as something impossible and sat down to read the paper before I went to bed. The front page article was about a murder that had taken place a week before. A high school senior, a star quarterback, had been stabbed. The police found it odd, as the heart had been taken out, and there were chips of obsidian in the wounds. I found it odd to say the least, but I too was too tired to see any significance and went to bed. Over the next 2 weeks, more killings had occurred. Each was the same as the first. A star athlete was the victim, the heart removed, and obsidian pieces were found in the wounds. It was oddly warm for late October. The wind felt the same that day, in the Amazon, like a breath of an animal, blowing down your neck. I was still trying to figure out what the significance of the disc was, but I was drawing a blank. I had cleaned off my blood, and the image seemed to have changed. The king on the throne now had a gruesome smile. The disc had been giving off a glow ever since my blood had spilled on it, but lately it had seemed to be glowing even brighter. Steady waves of heat seemed to be coming off it as well. Unnerved, I set the disc down and went online to see if I could find any information about it. I stumbled across an article about the Mayan deities. It appeared the king on the throne was an early depiction of the sun god Kinuch-Aha. This would explain the carving. Yet the heat and light coming off the disc was a different matter. Continuing my research, I found an obscure website which contained odd ideas. According to the website, all the pagan gods existed, but their power declined as they lost worshippers. They would weaken even more as their temples were destroyed. They never went away completely as long as they had at least one item of power still tying to them in this realm. A simple sacrifice was all that had been needed to reawaken them. I leaned back in my chair and wiped off the sweat from my forehead. I had found the last relic of a forgotten sun god. I called Michaela to tell her the significance of what I had found, but she still didn't answer my calls. I got a bad feeling, so I decided to drive to her house and see her, even if I had to break in. I grabbed my keys and told my wife and daughter to get into the car. As soon as I got outside, I knew it wasn't going to be an easy task. A large storm was coming in, and it seemed to be centered around Michaela's house. I jumped into the car and started to drive. Something seemed determined to keep me away, because everywhere I turned, uprooted trees were blocking my path. I knew that driving was hopeless at this point, so I got out to walk. I had my wife and daughter sit in the car, and I fought the rain and hail and the wind to get to her house. I tried to get in the door, but it was locked. I took a few steps back and took a running charge at the door. As soon as I broke through, I felt something hit the back of my head, and I was out cold. When I came to, I was taped to a chair. Michaela was standing over me with a sacrificial obsidian knife. "Don't try to stop me, James," she said. "Kinuch-Aha spoke to me. He told me that your blood was what had started to revive him. He said all I had to do was fully revive him, and he would bring back John. Think of it, you, John, and I back together again, just like the old times." "You've lost your mind, Michaela," I told her. "Well, I want to be with John again. So I looked up the ritual of resurrection. You need 10 hearts of a worthy sacrifice. That is why I killed all the little stars in the town. Only those who have shown that they are superior are worthy of being sacrifices. I have those now. Now all I have to do is sacrifice a mother and a daughter, and spill their blood on the disc, and Kinuch-Aha will be awake, and John will come with him. When you see me next, John will be with me." She left, and I struggled against my bonds. Luckily, she had always been bad at tying knots. I broke the knots and struggled to my feet. I had a feeling that I knew who she was going to sacrifice. I fought the storm on the way to my house. I came across an area where my car was parked, but it was no longer there. Everything that had been in the way between my car and my home had been moved off the street. I ran the rest of the way home and charged up my deck and into the house, just in time to see Michaela plunge the knife into my wife's throat. My daughter was already at her feet, blood pooling onto the disc. I tackled Michaela, but the damage was already done. As soon as my wife's blood touched the disc, it started to shake violently. I looked down at Michaela and saw the knife sticking out of her own chest. After all she had done for him, this God had just let her die. I knew I had to stop him somehow, so I thought back to what I had heard about the haunted or possessed items. All you had to do to stop them was seal them in glass. I grabbed the disc and placed it in my fish tank. The disc stopped glowing and stopped shaking. The temperature quickly cooled down, and the storm outside turned to a snowfall, like what it should have been this late in November. I am writing all of this down so you can know what life has been like for me in the past few weeks. Now, I am off to see my friends and my family. The preceding story was found on the computer of a Mr. James Evergreen. Following a police investigation, authorities believe that the death of John Rockefeller destroyed the sanity of Mr. Evergreen. This led to a gruesome ritualistic murder of several local teams and ended with the murder of Michaela Draconis along with Sarah and Jessica Evergreen. Mr. Evergreen had been found hanging from his ceiling fan, over the bodies of his last victims. No trace of the mysterious gold disc was ever found.